All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Welcome to everyone, both here in person and the many who are joining us online for the 18th annual CNAS National Security Conference. The theme this year is high stakes. I think the reasons for that should probably be clear. With a looming presidential election at home, with conflicts and threats in multiple regions, decisions being made by policymakers today will reverberate far into the future. So during this conference, we'll explore global security challenges and issues like artificial intelligence, economic statecraft, the defense industrial base, deterrence, alongside developments in Europe and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. It's particularly appropriate, even dramatic moment to have a set of discussions like this. It's, as we all know, the 80th anniversary of D-Day today, when U.S. forces and their allies launched history's largest amphibious invasion. That extraordinary operation saw brave troops storm Normandy's shore, defeat German defenses, and help bring about, in less than a year, an end to the terrible war in Europe. D-Day also sparked geopolitical changes, the likes of which still animate our world today. In its wake saw the emergence of the United States and Russia as superpowers, the eclipse of European colonial empires, and the restructuring of global order. That order, 8 decades later, is under new and perhaps unprecedented pressure, and once again, the American role will be critical in determining its fate. Today, we've got a series of interactive sessions and discussions, and we encourage both our in-person and online audiences to be active in them. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to recognize our conference sponsors: Exeger, Agility, American Rheinmetall Defense, Boeing, Cisco, Meta, Total Energies, and Western Digital. Thank you to you and to our institutional donors for helping to make all of this possible. To engage in the discussions, you can follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at CNASDC, and tweet under the hashtag CNAS 2024. You can also join the conversation and submit questions by using the chat on the official conference website. That's conference.cnas.org. And to kick off the day's deliberations, I'm delighted to invite to the stage Jon Finer. Jon is Principal Deputy National Security Advisor at the National Security Council. His portfolio includes all geographies and issues. So Jon, thank you for joining us today. Please join us on the stage, and we'll get the conversation started. Jon, thank you for joining us. As I just mentioned, you have a jurisdiction that is the whole world and every issue in it. So maybe I can start with a kind of a big picture question, which is there's a lot going on, to state the obvious. There's war in Europe, there's war in the Middle East, there are challenges in multiple regions. The administration has identified the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific as its priority region, and China as its enduring long-term challenge to address. How do you think about the priorities of the United States at a time when we have, as we always will, finite time, resources, and attention?
First, thanks for the question, but also thanks for having me. I have a lot of respect for the work you all do, including some of the help you're providing as we prepare for the NATO summit later this summer here in Washington, D.C., and grateful for the good work that comes out of CNAS. Look, what you've put your finger on is a challenge that we think about all the time in the context of how we structure the policy process at the NSC and for the administration, because we don't have the luxury of ignoring two major global crises that the United States is deeply involved in, and rightfully deeply involved in. But we also have an obligation and a responsibility to make sure that we don't lose sight of the affirmative agenda that you described, first and foremost in the Indo-Pacific, which we have described in all of our seminal national security documents, National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, as the most strategically consequential region of the world. The good news is that we're a big government, and the scarce resource of senior officials' time can be allocated to address all of these crises while keeping our eye on the ball in terms of this affirmative agenda. And I think we've demonstrated that just in the course of the months since October 7th, when we entered this period of two sustained conflicts, where during that time we have hosted significant historic trilateral meetings involving Indo-Pacific leaders. We've hosted all of the leaders of our own hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, at the White House with the President of the United States. We have hosted the first African head of state for a state visit in more than 15 years at the White House with Kenyan President Ruto. Recently, we've hosted a summit between the President and Xi Jinping at Woodside that helped provide a degree of stability in that relationship. All of that in the context of these two major global crises that you are seeing play out day in, day out, and that require and deserve the time and energy that we're providing for them.
Let me just follow up on one aspect of this, which is, there's, I guess, to some degree, a debate about the degree to which a crisis in one region is a major distraction from the real game, wherever you believe the real game to be, if the real game is, competing against China and Asia. Or whether these issues and regions are fundamentally connected, so that, for example, the outcome of the war in Ukraine is going to have an effect on how China and others think about the opportunities or lack thereof in Asia. And so, which I think is where our Asian friends themselves come down. So that I think you come down on the side of this interconnection, but maybe you could say how you think about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, we see this debate. I think we reject the notion that these are sort of zero-sum trade-offs among regions of the world. I don't think that's how the world works, how the world is organized, how this actually plays out in practice. I think when countries around the world look at the level of support that the United States and our allies are providing for Ukraine, they see the value proposition of partnership with the United States potentially for them if they're in a moment of crisis or face an aggressor the way Ukraine does with Russia. I don't think that's lost on countries far beyond the European theater where the Ukraine conflict is taking place. Similarly, the way the United States has stood up for Israel in the face of the aggression by Hamas on October 7th and by Iran, first and foremost on April 13th, when Iran launched an unprecedented attack on Israel. 300 munitions fired from Iran and from its proxies against Israel that the United States, some of our core European partners, and other countries in the region stood up against and defeated. And I think countries around the world that see that the world is an increasingly turbulent place, that face potentially their own would-be aggressors, see what the United States has done, can do in those situations, and see the value of partnership, alliance with the United States, whether they're in those regions or not.
And presumably that underlying reality is not going to go away, and therefore, even if one cares most about outcomes in Asia or with China, there's a lot bound up in the continuing support to Ukraine.
Absolutely. And by the way, you hear this not just from the United States and our European partners, you hear this from our Asian allies as well. And one of the things we're proudest of in this administration is that we have strengthened our European alliances, we have strengthened our Indo-Pacific relationships and alliances, and we have actually deepened and intensified the interconnection between them. Our European allies are, to a much greater extent than ever before, invested in our interests, which they see as their interests as well, in the Indo-Pacific. Our Indo-Pacific allies are stepping up to provide support for Ukraine. Not necessarily something they might have considered a core interest of theirs 5 years ago. So we think that all of this redounds to our benefit, strengthens the United States, and advances our interests in all of these regions.
Okay, another big picture question. The president has often talked about the competition between democracies and autocracies, and how democracies need to show that democracy itself works and that democracy wins. One hears, I guess, criticism of that framing to some degree, both from two different perspectives. One that will say, well, if the world is fundamentally split between democracies and autocracies, and we're on the side of the democracies, why are we trying to broker deals with Saudi Arabia and other autocracies? The other is, well, I mean, if we're going to compete effectively with China, we need countries that are autocracies on our side. So, you sort of get it from both directions. How does that actually play out in practice, this framing of a world divided between democracies and autocracies?
Thanks. So to be honest, I feel like this getting it from both sides, this debate is much more the case in kind of academic and policy.
I'm not going to take that personally,
analyst
but go
circles
ahead.
than
Go
it
ahead.
is in
Go
the real
ahead.
world.
Go ahead. Be cutting close to the bone.
Well, you've got experience in both camps. So
Go ahead.
So,
No, go ahead.
and the reality is, what we have always said about this is, one, our deepest and closest partnerships are going to be with our democratic allies. That is core to how the president sees the world, how the president wants to organize the world. And to be honest, we believe that if there were more democratic countries in the world, that would redound to the benefit of the United States. We would have closer relationships with many, if not all of those countries. But he's also been quite clear that this is not a mutually exclusive situation, that we are, for both practical reasons, geopolitical reasons, and because it benefits the people of the United States, going to maintain and improve our relationships with countries that maybe don't govern themselves exactly the way we do, but that view the international system and the way the international system is organized in a way that is much more consistent with us than how countries like Russia and China that want to tear down some of these post-World War II structures view the international system. So we have deepened and intensified, for example, our relationship with a country like Vietnam, upgrading to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We have worked to integrate Israel with the countries of the Middle East, not because they're all Jeffersonian democracies, but because we think it will be fundamentally stabilizing for the Middle East, good for our ally Israel, good for our own interests if Israel is further integrated in the region. That's a work in progress and something that we very much think is important to continue to try to advance. And so the president will always believe that our core partners, our core allies, the democracies of Europe and Asia and other parts of the world are at the center of our foreign policy, one of the foundations of our strength in the world and a force multiplier for the United States. But that is not a mutually exclusive worldview, and we will look to deepen our partnerships with other countries as well.
Okay, let's talk about a few specific issues. So Ukraine, I was there a few months ago, and you could just see how difficult the situation was during this 6-month pause in the military assistance to Ukraine. And of course, at least the publicly stated objectives of the Ukrainian government remain, I think, the same, which is to be able to get the return of all of their territory, including Crimea. And then we know Russia's made gains on the ground, particularly in the Kharkiv region. So what, as of right now, what does victory look like? What does success look like from your point of view? And what is the theory of success given the situation on the ground?
So I'd say a few things. One, I'm not going to challenge your characterization of how difficult things are right now. I think they are quite difficult. I think there are a range of reasons for that, maybe even first and foremost, that the resources that our administration sought to provide to Ukraine were delayed 6-7 months while Congress debated whether to provide them. Ultimately, they did, and that's a good thing, but that left us with a gap and with a hole to fill. But taking a step back, I do think it's important to consider that a year ago, when Ukraine was on the cusp of launching its counteroffensive against Russia, there was probably an unrealistic degree of optimism here about how much that was going to accomplish. Ultimately, they did succeed in retaking some of their territory. Similarly, in the current moment, I think there is probably an undue degree of negativity and pessimism about how much Russia is actually accomplishing in its own offensive north of Kharkiv. Russia has succeeded in taking a narrow strip of territory basically along its border that we do not see, and I don't think Ukraine sees, as strategically consequential in terms of the overall trajectory of the war. They have poured enormous resources into trying to take that territory. They have paid an enormous price for doing so, and they have basically at this point been blunted, been stopped by the Ukrainian army, just a few miles across the border from Russia. So I don't think we see this as a period of strategic peril, as difficult as things are currently on the battlefield. And I think the job that we have now is to make sure the resources that we have received and that the other countries in the coalition are providing flow as quickly as possible to Ukraine. We have made some policy changes to enable Ukraine to make sure that Russian forces cannot take advantage of what they perceived maybe at one point to be a safe haven just across their border to take pot shots at Ukraine. They can't do that any longer because of some of the policy decisions that the president has made. The offensive has largely been halted. And again, I always remind people of this. Take a step back and put yourself in the mindset of where we were in this conflict 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when it was just getting started. If you had said that 2 years, 2.5 years into this conflict, Russia and Ukraine would still be fighting along more or less the same geography where they were fighting up until, from 2014 to 2022, I think people would have considered that a massive failure, given the ambitions that Russia had for this war. In terms of what success looks like, look, we'll let Ukraine define for itself. We have said we are strongly supportive of any outcome in which Ukraine remains independent, free, sovereign, democratic. But I think the strategic goal for all of us should be ensuring that Russia does not feel that time is on its side, that it can just wait out Ukraine and its supporters and continue to press over time, and ultimately Ukraine supporters will lose will. I think the supplemental appropriations was a huge demonstration of that. I think you will see us at the NATO summit make a series of steps and commitments that will also demonstrate a long-term perspective that we are in this for, as the President has said, as long as it takes. And the more that we do that, and the more that Russia, and really when we say Russia, we really only mean one person, ultimately concludes that they cannot just buy time and be in a better place 1 year from now or 5 years from now, the odds of Ukraine's success, which is critical to all of us, go way up.
So why not, as some have suggested, just go to Putin and say, let's cut a deal, you keep the stuff you've got, you keep the territory you have, and all of that? I mean, this is a straw man, I guess I'm presenting to you, because
Are you making the case for this?
I'm not making the case. I think precisely the opposite. But what I wanted to get at is your assessment that Putin's strategic aims have changed, even if one believes that he'd be content with the Donbass. They're conducting military operations in areas outside the Donbass, and does that not suggest that his strategic aims remain much more expansive than the territories currently under his control, and therefore that has something to do with the outcome that we might seek? Is that where, how you guys see it?
So I guess first and foremost, I don't think Russia's strategic aims have changed. Maybe their sense of timing has changed. They realized this was a much more difficult proposition than maybe they thought. I'm not sure they expected to lose killed or casualties, 350,000 Russian forces 2.5 years into this conflict. I'm not sure that was part of their assessment going into this. So I do think they maintain the ambition to dominate Ukraine, physically and capture as much Ukrainian territory as they can. And they are not showing, I think, any signs of any real interest in stopping this war. They do pay lip service sometimes to the fact that they're open to talking about any outcome and to negotiating. The reality is we don't see any indication that they're actually serious about stopping this war on terms that would be acceptable to the international community or to Ukraine, that respect the sort of fundamental tenets of the UN Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity. So I don't think Russia's serious about pursuing the type of outcome that you're describing. But the most important reason why that is a non-starter right now is it's a non-starter to the government of Ukraine and, frankly, to the people of Ukraine. All the data shows and common sense dictates that the Ukrainians are not going to be content to settle for that outcome. So it is certainly not for the United States or any other outside country to contemplate some sort of deal that does not respect fundamentally the views and objectives of the government that is actually doing the fighting and on whose territory this war is being fought.
Okay, switching gears, let's talk a little bit about industrial policy, which has been a key element of the administration's efforts to, I suppose, buy down national security risk in key areas and also strengthen American resilience and its economy at home. So first, just as a matter of industrial policy, it's not clear to me whether folks in the administration think, okay, there's a certain amount of national security risk and there'll be costs associated with industrial policy, whether it's subsidies or export controls or whatever you want to put into place. But we need to be willing as taxpayers and as Americans to pay that cost in order to reduce the risk. Or you also get an economic benefit that this is going to create the new industries of the future and we're going to build these at home and this will be sort of net plus economically in the United States. Is there a view on what the sort of underpinnings, why industrial policy is a good thing?
I guess I'd say a few things. I think our sense is that the sort of disconnect between, leaving aside, the phrase industrial policy, which I think can mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
The previous way of making economic policy and foreign policy is that these issues were discussed often by different people in different rooms with no real connection in terms of objectives and outcomes from one discussion to the other. And I don't think, candidly, that was to the benefit of advancing American interests and benefiting the American people at home, because these were not coordinated, not integrated. We pretended almost as if these were totally separate domains. This president came in with a very different theory, and when he articulates how America advances its interests in the world and positions ourselves to be as strong as possible in doing so, he starts from two foundational premises. One, we need stronger alliances. We talked quite a lot about that. And two, we need a stronger economy that delivers better for the American people, not just as a domestic issue, but as a pillar and source of our strength in the world. And so these foundational investments that the president made, with the help of Congress in a deeply polarized political environment in Washington, are core to our domestic policy. They're also core to our foreign policy. And what we are seeing, I think, increasingly is that partners and allies around the world are taking one of two approaches. Either they are looking to emulate what the United States has done in terms of these big public investments, in terms of, frankly, placing significant controls on sensitive technologies, on outbound investment, concern about overcapacity, which is something you're hearing our Treasury Department talk quite a lot about, but is not unique to the United States. Countries like Brazil are concerned about Chinese industrial overcapacity. You're seeing a lot of countries actually take our approach and emulate it, in part because I think they see it also connected to their own security, shoring up supply chains and the like, and in part because they see the performance of the U.S. economy, which right now, I wouldn't even say in spite of, I'd say largely, I think because of the approach that we have taken, is the strongest performing economy in the industrialized world.
One of the things you mentioned was some of the controls and I guess the recent round of tariffs and things like that on Chinese EVs and things like that. So for many years, the sort of holy grail has been a source of clean energy that would be available to consumers at a reasonable price, the price that would contest the use of fossil fuels. And now we have it, or I should say, at least China has it when it comes to autos, so it's here. And the administration's moving to keep that out. Why is the threat of Chinese electric vehicles or whatever kind of green technology you might be talking about greater than mitigating the threat from climate change that could generate?
So I think I would reject that dichotomy and that framing, but let me say a couple things. One is we recognize the critical nature of clean technology and clean energy, and the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is going to go down in history as one of the most consequential pieces of legislation for exactly this reason, that the United States cannot and should not be left on the sidelines of the sort of fundamental building blocks of building that economy. Cannot cede that terrain entirely to countries like China or anyone else. And because of this piece of legislation, we no longer in a position where we have to do that. That's one. Second, on EVs, I think it's important also to point out there are not a lot of Chinese EVs being sold in the United States right now. So that's point one. It's not as if American consumers are currently flush with Chinese autos, and the administration has decided to cut them off. Tiny fraction of the fleet here. But second, why has China been able to produce such cheap electric vehicles for the world? It is not just because they do this better than other countries do or than American automakers do. It's because they have been heavily and highly subsidized. And it's that sort of unfair practice that, frankly, the president, first among administrations in the United States, is standing up to in a range of ways, and enabling American automakers to actually compete on this terrain. And while I think the reaction was a bit mixed from other countries around the world, you're now, I think, seeing other countries look at that model and consider it seriously themselves. The European Union is launching an investigation into Chinese EVs and whether they are going to take steps that look something like what we've just done. So let's see how this plays out. But ultimately, I think over the medium term, what it will mean is American automakers are able to compete in this critical market going forward in a way that they would not have been absent steps like this, because the playing field was fundamentally unfair.
The China dynamic is often described as a mixture of competition and cooperation, or at least that because we're in this competition in so many fields, that should not exclude cooperation in areas where our interests overlap. So global health, non-proliferation, climate, maybe North Korea, a few other things. But you don't really see much on the cooperation side. Is it really kind of the reality that although, yeah, in theory, we may have these interests that overlap with China, and in theory, cooperation is possible, in practice, this competition is such that it kind of infects what would otherwise be a spirit of cooperation?
Look, I'd say a few things about that. I don't think we or anyone else ever said that competition and cooperation would be in equal measure. In fact, I think we've been quite clear that we see a sort of fundamental dimension of the U.S.-China relationship as being competitive. So I don't think we've ever denied that or shied away from it. And in fact, it's an insight that we don't do this a lot, but give credit to our predecessor administration for. I think a proper diagnosis of the challenge and of the problem. We have many issues with how they went about pursuing that competition, starting with the fact that they left partners and allies totally on the sidelines, which we think are a huge force multiplier in competing with China. But the fundamental diagnosis that it's a competitive relationship is correct. And one of the things that I think is interesting about 2023 and early 2024 is we really were able to do both. We started 2023, and I won't go into all the reasons for this, at what is probably going to be recognized as an historical nadir in the U.S.-China relationship. Broad perception that things were veering in a very dangerous direction. And through the course of careful but intensive diplomatic work, building towards the summit between President Xi and President Biden in California that I referenced earlier, we put the relationship on a much more stable footing. At that summit, to your question about cooperation, we launched 3 new significant areas of cooperation, restoring a degree of military-to-military communication that we think is important for crisis management and for a whole range of other reasons. Cooperating on counter-narcotics and fentanyl, which you could make a strong case is maybe the biggest challenge facing the United States, just sheerly in terms of the death toll that this is taking on the American people. And then a dialogue on AI, which is going to be a seminal and foundational technology of the future, reorient, reshape all of our lives over the course of the years, and China is going to play a role in that. So 3 new areas of conversation with China, much more stable footing in the overall relationship. But during the course of the last 12 to 18 months, we also did not in any way take our foot off the gas in terms of competitive actions vis-a-vis the Chinese. Whether it's protecting America's data security, whether it's 301 upgrade of our tariff structure, whether it's outbound investment regulations, whether it's new and enhanced export controls on technologies like semiconductors and the tools used to make them. We took this series of steps in the context of a relationship that was very turbulent and very challenging, and managed to keep things stable and pointing in the right direction, while putting us in a stronger competitive position vis-a-vis China than we were 18 months ago, and an economy in the United States, frankly, that is on a much stronger footing.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll take 1 or 2 from the audience here, so be thinking of your brilliant questions. We can have microphones go around too. Israel, Gaza. Israel's stated objective remains the destruction of Hamas as a political and military force in Gaza. Is that an achievable objective from your point of view? And where do you see this going over the next few weeks here after the president gave his remarks last Friday about the ceasefire and peace ideas?
Look, what I will say is what we believe the the core objectives are for this conflict, at least from the American perspective. One is that Hamas cannot be allowed to threaten Israel in the way that it did on October 7th. Simply no country would tolerate that sort of threat on its border, and the steps that Israel has taken since then, we believe, have fundamentally left them in a position in which Hamas has been degraded to a degree that is no longer possible in the current moment. That's an important objective. Second, Hamas can no longer be allowed to govern Gaza. Israel should not have to tolerate government on its border that perpetrated the sort of attack that took place on October 7th. No country would tolerate that. Where this goes from here, I think, as you well know, and the President laid this out with a lot of clarity on Friday, showed much more transparency about the kind of internal workings of this than we had before, is that we are potentially on the cusp of an agreement that could lead to the end of this conflict. But that is not guaranteed. And right now, Israel, to its credit, has put on the table a very serious proposal that would lead to the return of hostages, that would lead to a ceasefire, that would enable a massive increase in humanitarian assistance, which we believe is desperately needed in Gaza right now, and that would create the possibility for a day after this conflict in which Israel is safer, Israel is more integrated in its region, because of the possibility of normalization with countries that it does not yet have diplomatic relations with, where the northern border, which we're extremely concerned about, and the skirmishing back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah, the temperature of that is turned down, and where the Palestinians, for the first time in recent memory, have the prospect of a political horizon that ultimately will lead to a state. And we're not Pollyannish that all of that is going to happen overnight. In fact, all of that is going to be extremely difficult to sort of make real in the world. But the door to that future opens if this deal can be reached and we can start to de-escalate and ultimately end the conflict in Gaza. And the other path, the path away from that, we believe is fundamentally worse for Israel, certainly worse for the Palestinian people, worse for our interests in the region and the wider world. So that's why the President put his thumb on the scale as firmly as he did. And we are working very hard to get that deal done.
So is the ball in Hamas's court right now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. If there are questions here, we've got a microphone, and I think there's an iPad here for things that are coming on from some of our online viewers, which I'll take a look here and see if there's anything. I do see. Okay, there's a lot. There's a whole lot. Maybe one question is, there's actually several questions coming in about the sort of military and security networking that the administration has been involved in the Indo-Pacific. So the upgrading with AUKUS and then the upgrading of the alliance with Japan. So maybe you could say just a little bit about one, maybe to just extend this, one, what are we aiming for in all of this? And then two, just to, some of the counter action or counter arguments you sometimes hear is, hey, look, we're surrounding China, right? China's going to look out and say, oh, the United States is beefing up its security relations with Australia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Japan, South Korea, all this other stuff. And this is the kind of encirclement that's going to elicit from China the kind of behavior that we're seeking to avoid in the first place. How do you think about that?
Sure. So let's go through the list. Trilateral cooperation with Japan and the ROK, including at the head of state level, unimaginable several years ago, now a fundamental reality of the security architecture and political architecture of the Indo-Pacific through very hard work and intensive diplomacy in this administration. Upgrading our defense cooperation with the Philippines, a strategically significant country and ally that is under the threat day in, day out of coercion from the PRC. Head of state level Quad, which is not maybe at its core a security partnership, but certainly has a significant security dimension and has been structurally hugely consequential for us in our engagement in the Indo-Pacific and the wider world. You mentioned AUKUS. which sort of goes without saying, a path-breaking partnership among three close allies, put it that way, on submarines, but also on other aspects of defense cooperation, and on and on and on. Now, we will say, and we believe it, that none of this is focused on or focused against any particular country. But if it makes any country uncomfortable, it will be countries that want to coerce their neighbors, because fundamentally, this architecture is designed to protect against that. So countries that are uncomfortable with U.S. alliances, U.S. partnerships, the upgrading of our relations in the region, I think a good question for them is, why does that make you uncomfortable? Does that make you uncomfortable because otherwise you would be able to coerce and bully other countries in the region? These partnerships and relationships are freely chosen. We are not pushing anybody into deepening these relationships with us. They want to do that for their own reasons, for their own security. So I would take that question that was at the back end of what you asked and put it back on any country that indicates a degree of discomfort with this. These are defensive relationships. They are stability enhancing, and the only countries that should be concerned are countries that have designs that I think are not defensible themselves.
And to be clear, I never hear that argument from countries in the region, just people here in D.C. So, I think Brian Katulis here had a question. Just introduce yourself and tell us your affiliation.
Brian Katulis with the Middle East Institute. John, thanks for your service, and Richard, thanks for this forum. You mentioned the national industrial policy America has and how other countries have followed suit. When you look at what's unfolded, what do you see as the biggest opportunities in those relationships? Is it in Asia? What are the challenges also? Because there's competition even with our closest allies, and this concept of friendshoring, which I think is important, is one that I think needs greater clarity about how do we actually solidify this in this competitive landscape.
Sure, thanks. I'll talk about two related areas. One is supply chains, and supply chains, for the most critical resources that the United States needs and that otherwise might be dominated by countries that aren't our closest friends. There is no scenario in which all of our most important supply chains can be entirely contained to the United States. So we need a network of relationships with other countries that allow us to diversify. Several years ago, many of these supply chains were wholly dependent on one or two countries, some of whom don't always have our best interests or core interests in mind. And we have tried to reorient that, diversify that, to put ourselves on a stronger footing. That's one. One particular supply chain that I think is worth focusing on is critical minerals. Another area that, a decade ago, 5 years ago, and even to some extent still today, is far too dominated by one or two large players that, frankly, to their credit, moved early, cornered a bunch of markets, and then in a contingency, in a crisis, could use their dominance over some of these core materials to their strategic advantage and against ours. That's not a situation that we should just sit back and tolerate. Leaving aside whether we did not move quickly enough 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we are moving very quickly at that problem now. So those are two areas. And those are defensive. I'll give you one more, though, that's much more in the affirmative category, because it demonstrates, again, the value proposition of working with the United States. There is a massive infrastructure gap that exists in the world, $1 trillion plus just in the global south alone. The United States is now playing on that field in a significant way, not in a coercive way, in a transparent way that brings to bear our core strategic advantage, which is private sector that other countries cannot compete with, and working in strategically consequential regions for us, like Africa, like the India-Middle East corridor, like the Philippines, where we recently announced another major infrastructure project and investment. We were not playing on this field 3, 4, 5 years ago. We are now putting real dollars behind it, using our investments as a multiplier and leverage for outside investments from other countries, from our private sector, in a way that we think meets a need and fundamentally benefits our partners in those parts of the world.
I think there was a question. Yes, sir, right here. Just wait 1 second for the microphone.
I'd like to circle back into Ukraine for a moment. If we look at last year's offensive, a lot of it was a failure of not having close air support. The Air Force is really eager to get rid of their A-10s. We've flown about 8,000 combat missions and only lost 5 of them. This is a plane that was designed exactly to kill out the former Soviet tank. something you can do in the National Security Council to push that asset forward? It's easy to fly, easy to handle, and we could probably get it to them quicker. We still have 200 that are flying in the nation.
And maybe as you answer that fairly specific question, you might put it a little bit in the context of just how the administration's and the president's continuing to think about the provision of weapon systems or the kinds of decisions made recently to allow for weapons to be, American weapons to be used on Russian territory. The sort of weighing up of the escalatory potential on the one hand and the support to Ukraine on the other.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Look, I'm not a military analyst. Maybe you are, but I, over the last 2.5 years, like everybody else working on the Ukraine file, have had to really deepen our understanding of weapon systems, of munitions, of battlefield dynamics. I'm not sure I agree with the read that that was the fundamental problem with Ukraine's counteroffensive last year. I mean, they just had real challenges with physical impediments on the ground. Turns out moving as an infantry or as a mechanized infantry through a minefield, like the ones that the Russians laid, with other physical barriers that the Russians put in place, is just exceedingly difficult. It's slow. It causes high casualties for the force that is trying to move in that direction, and it proved to be a formidable challenge. I don't accept the characterization of it as a failure. The fact that Ukraine was able to keep Russia on the defensive, on the back foot for so many months during the course of last year in a conflict where everybody expected the only one direction of travel. How much Ukrainian territory will Russia be able to swallow? All last year, the big question that was being debated was how much of Ukraine's territory is it going to be able to get back? And it did get back some. So that is a much better circumstance, frankly, than I think many people believed we would be encountering in 2023. Did it accomplish as much as Ukraine wanted, as much as we wanted? No, I don't think it did. But I'm not sure that reason of close air support was the biggest, most consequential reason for that to be the case. Taking a step back to Richard's question, you know, the way we think about new systems, some of the policy decisions, I think one of the things that we have come to believe deeply is that there is this notion sometimes, and I'll caricature it a little bit in the public debate about the Ukraine war, that they are one weapon, one system away from some sort of massive breakthrough where they will fundamentally be able to get that system and run roughshod over the Russian army. This is not that kind of war. And the best evidence for that is we have provided now many of those systems that people were making that argument about. And while we think it has fundamentally helped and strengthened Ukraine to do that, it has not been a total game changer. No one weapon system has been a total game changer. At the end of the day, this conflict between two very similar armies in some ways is much more about the kind of basic blocking and tackling that frankly, I think many of us did not really fully appreciate would remain a key facet of modern warfare. Production of, you know, not super high tech, but critically important munitions, which we had let lapse in this country. Our European partners in their defense industrial base had let lapse. And we are now taking significant action to get our act together on those things. To be honest, if there are two things that we could provide an infinite number of to the Ukrainians to try to turn the tide in this war, it would be artillery munitions and air defense interceptors. Those would be, I think, the two most consequential things that we could provide in the current moment, and we just don't make enough of them, but we are making more, and by early next year, we think we'll be in a much stronger position. Russia is also massively increasing its defense industrial base, and so this is going to be a competition that takes place on the battlefield. It's also going to be a competition that takes place in our factories in Europe, in factories in Ukraine, where we are launching co-production of a number of these key capabilities. All of that against what Russia is doing, backed by, unfortunately, and we talk about this quite a bit, North Korea, Iran, and while not with lethal assistance, certainly with inputs to its defense industrial base by China as well. Which we are trying to highlight much more because, if anything, that is the single biggest input that's benefiting Russia on the battlefield.
Well, as many of us know, not from firsthand experience, but having seen sometimes close up, the position that you're in, Deputy National Security Advisor, is one of the most difficult, most wide-ranging, most critical positions in the U.S. government. So let you get back to it. thank you for
Probably
being
rather stay
here.
all day when you put it that way.
Thank you for being here, and more importantly, thank you for your service to our country. Jon Finer, thank you.